Dr. Evelyn Carter, a brilliant yet often controversial scientist, had always believed that the greatest discoveries came from asking the questions others were too afraid to ask. For years, her work at the Institute of Biophysical Studies had pushed boundaries, exploring topics that others shied away from, topics that made even her colleagues uneasy. But this time, her latest project had sparked an uproar, not just in the scientific community but among the general public. The question was deceptively simple: what happens inside a coffin after burial? It wasn't the kind of question one discussed over dinner or even among peers. To most, it was morbid, unnecessary, and even disrespectful. But Evelyn saw it differently. She believed that understanding what truly happened beneath the earth could hold profound implications for science. From medicine to archaeology and even environmental research, the answers could shed light on processes that humanity had ignored for centuries. Still, bringing this project to life was no small feat. Ethics boards had balked at the idea, branding it macabre. Religious groups called it sacrilegious, and even her own colleagues labeled it sensationalist. For months, Evelyn had faced rejection after rejection, her grant applications denied with cold, formal responses. Yet she remained steadfast, knowing the potential of the experiment was too great to abandon. Her breakthrough came from an unlikely ally, Harold Whitman, a retired professor of anthropology who had followed Evelyn's career for years. At 82, Harold was in the twilight of his life, battling a terminal illness that had left him physically frail but mentally sharp. "I've always believed in the pursuit of knowledge, Evelyn," Harold had said during their first meeting. His voice, though weakened, carried the conviction of a man who had lived a life of curiosity. "If my passing can contribute to science, why should I refuse? After all, death is inevitable. What matters is what we leave behind." His words had struck a chord with Evelyn. Here was a man unafraid of death, willing to embrace it as a means to further humanity's understanding of life. Harold became not just a participant, but a partner in the project, his calm acceptance inspiring Evelyn and her team to push forward despite the mounting criticism. The day of Harold's burial was overcast, with gray clouds casting long shadows over the cemetery. It was a small, intimate ceremony. Harold's family, his daughter, 2 grandchildren, and a few close friends gathered to say their final goodbyes. They had been hesitant about Harold's decision, but ultimately respected his wishes. Evelyn stood at a respectful distance, dressed in a simple black coat, her usual confident demeanor tempered by the solemnity of the occasion. Her team was present as well, quietly observing. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, ensuring that the tiny camera and environmental sensors installed inside Harold's coffin were unobtrusive and secure. Every detail had been meticulously planned to respect Harold's dignity while collecting the data they needed. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. This was, after all, someone's loved one. Yet she reminded herself of Harold's words. "Knowledge is the greatest legacy we can leave behind." Back at the lab, the team began their work in earnest. The live feed from the camera transmitted a clear, high-definition image of the coffin's interior, a serene and undisturbed space lined with soft white fabric. The sensors buzzed quietly, recording data on temperature, humidity, and oxygen levels. The experiment had officially begun. Back in the lab, Evelyn Carter and her team settled into their workstations, their eyes fixed on the monitors displaying the live feed from the coffin. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the equipment and the faint tapping of keyboards. Despite the intense preparations leading up to this moment, now that the experiment had begun, an uneasy stillness had descended over the lab. The camera feed showed the pristine interior of Harold's coffin, a small confined space lined with white satin, untouched and undisturbed. The sensors, which Evelyn had insisted be top of the line, delivered stable readings. The temperature remained constant, the humidity levels steady, and the oxygen inside the sealed coffin was exactly as predicted. Evelyn sat at the central console, her hands resting lightly on the desk. She glanced around the room, noting the mix of curiosity and apprehension on her team's faces. Daniel, the lead technician, was monitoring the video feed, his eyes scanning for any signs of disruption. Sarah, a junior scientist who had joined the project just 6 months ago, was meticulously logging data, her pen moving steadily across her notebook. Baseline readings are holding steady, Daniel announced, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but tinged with the excitement of being part of such a groundbreaking project. Good, Evelyn replied, nodding. This is just the beginning. We need patience. The first few hours will likely be uneventful. But even as she spoke, she felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on her. This was uncharted territory, a realm no living person had ever observed. The idea of peering into the unknown, of documenting the hidden processes that unfolded after burial, was both exhilarating and unnerving. Hours passed, and the feed remained unchanged. The interior of the coffin was still and silent, the soft fabric of the lining appearing almost luminous under the camera's infrared light. The team worked quietly, analyzing data and checking the equipment, but the monotony of the still image began to gnaw at their nerves. "Do you think we'll actually see anything?" Sarah asked hesitantly, breaking the silence. Evelyn glanced at her. "That's the question, isn't it? We're here to observe, to document. What we find or don't find will still contribute to our understanding." Sarah nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. For all their scientific rigor, there was an unspoken tension in the room. This wasn't just another experiment. It was a confrontation with the mysteries of life and death. Around the 6th hour, the lab grew quieter still. The team took turns stepping away for short breaks, but Evelyn remained at her station, her eyes glued to the screen. She reminded herself that the experiment was as much about patience as it was about discovery. Nature didn't adhere to human timelines. Then, something unexpected happened. "Wait," Daniel said, leaning closer to his monitor. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a sharp blade. "Did anyone else see that?" Evelyn's head snapped up. "See what?" Daniel rewound the footage, his fingers flying over the keyboard. There was, I don't know, something. A flicker, maybe? The team gathered around his station, their curiosity reignited. Frame by frame, Daniel played back the footage. At first it appeared identical to what they had been watching for hours, still, silent, undisturbed. But then they saw it. A faint flicker in the corner of the screen. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But it was there. "Could it be interference?" Sarah suggested, though her voice wavered with doubt. "Possibly," Daniel replied, though his expression betrayed his skepticism. "But this equipment is calibrated to filter out interference. This isn't typical." Evelyn leaned in, her sharp eyes scanning the screen. "Log it," she instructed. "Note the timestamp and keep monitoring. It could be nothing, or it could be the start of something." The room fell into an uneasy quiet once more. The flicker had been brief, but it left a lingering sense of unease. It was a reminder that they were venturing into the unknown, and anything, absolutely anything, could happen. As the clock ticked on, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of something extraordinary. The flicker might have been a minor anomaly, but it had stirred a sense of anticipation in the lab. The stillness of the coffin now felt charged, as though it was hiding secrets just waiting to be uncovered. By the 12th hour, the lab was steeped in an uneasy tension. The earlier flicker on the camera feed had been logged and analyzed, but no concrete explanation had emerged. Still, it lingered in everyone's minds, casting a shadow over the room's atmosphere. Evelyn Carter, seated at her desk with her eyes glued to the monitor, tapped her pen absent-mindedly against the notebook filled with detailed observations. The live feed remained unchanged, the still pristine interior of Harold's coffin illuminated by the faint glow of the camera's infrared light. The sensors continued to record stable data, and everything appeared normal. Yet the silence in the lab wasn't comforting, it was oppressive, as though the air itself had grown heavier with each passing hour. The quiet was abruptly broken. A faint sound crackled through the audio feed, so soft at first that no one reacted. It wasn't until the noise repeated, a soft, deliberate tapping, that Daniel froze in his chair. "Did anyone else hear that?" he whispered, his voice tinged with both curiosity and unease. The team stopped what they were doing, their heads snapping toward the audio feed. There it was again, a rhythmic tapping, 3 knocks followed by a pause and then 3 more. The sound wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to send a shiver through the room. "What could that be?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a breath. Evelyn leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Could it be settling soil?" she suggested, though the uncertainty in her tone was unmistakable. Daniel shook his head. "The sensors aren't picking up any movement in the ground around the coffin, and even if the soil shifted, it wouldn't sound like this." The tapping continued, each set of knocks as deliberate as the last. Evelyn took a deep breath and nodded toward Daniel. "Amplify the audio." He complied, and the sound grew louder. The taps were rhythmic, purposeful, nothing like the random creaks or groans they might have expected. It was too structured, too deliberate to be dismissed as mere coincidence. "What's causing this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling now. Her earlier enthusiasm for the experiment had been replaced by a growing sense of dread. "No assumptions yet," Evelyn replied firmly, though she felt the same unease creeping into her thoughts. "Log everything, check the audio equipment for interference." The team scrambled into action, running diagnostics on the microphones and reviewing the audio feed frame by frame. But everything appeared to be functioning perfectly. There was no evidence of interference, no technical errors. The taps were real, and they were coming from inside the coffin. "This doesn't make sense," Daniel muttered under his breath. "There's no airflow, no external movement. What could be making that sound?" The room fell silent again, everyone's attention fixed on the monitor. The tapping had stopped, but the unease it left behind was palpable. Evelyn's mind raced, grappling with the implications of what they had just witnessed. Was it the natural settling of the coffin, a trick of the equipment? Or was it something they hadn't even considered? Just as she was about to instruct the team to continue their analysis, the sound returned, this time louder and closer. The knocks echoed through the audio feed, steady and deliberate. Each knock seemed to resonate deeper than the last, as though the source of the sound was moving toward the camera. Evelyn raised her hand, signaling for silence. "No one speaks," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I want absolute quiet." The team obeyed, their breaths held as they listened intently. The tapping stopped again, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Evelyn's sharp eyes darted across the monitors, searching for any signs of movement. "Mark this," she instructed, her tone calm but strained. "We're documenting everything, every sound, every anomaly." The team nodded, their unease written plainly on their faces. This was no longer a routine observation. The tapping wasn't just a strange phenomenon, it felt intentional, as though it carried a message they couldn't yet decipher. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had prepared for so many variables, natural decomposition processes, environmental interactions, but this was something else entirely. Whatever was happening inside Harold's coffin, it was far beyond anything they had anticipated. By the 18th hour, the unease in the lab had grown heavier. The earlier tapping sounds, though logged and reviewed repeatedly, remained unexplained. Evelyn and her team had combed through the data, searching for anything that might offer a logical explanation. But the sensors detected no unusual vibrations, no shifts in the soil, and no technical errors. It was as if the sound had come from nowhere, and that, in itself, was terrifying. The team sat in tense silence, watching the live feed from the coffin. The stillness of the image now felt more ominous than comforting. Sarah kept glancing at the clock, her notebook filled with notes but her pen idle. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the screen but his expression distant, as if trying to make sense of what they had already witnessed. Then it happened. "Wait," Daniel said, his voice breaking the silence. "Look at that." Everyone turned to the monitor just in time to see it. The burial shroud inside the coffin shifted slightly. It wasn't much, just the faintest movement along one edge, but it was enough to send a chill through the room. That's movement," Sarah stammered, leaning closer to the screen. Her voice was shaky, her earlier curiosity now mixed with fear. "There's no airflow," Daniel said quickly, almost as if trying to reassure himself. "The coffin is sealed. Nothing should be moving." Evelyn's heart raced, but she kept her voice calm. "Rewind the footage. Slow it down." Daniel obeyed, replaying the moment frame by frame. The shroud's edge lifted ever so slightly before settling back into place. There was no visible cause for the movement, no sudden pressure, no external force. "It's impossible," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. "It shouldn't be happening." Evelyn straightened in her chair, her mind racing. She had anticipated many outcomes for this experiment, but this wasn't one of them. The movement defied logic, defied science, and yet it was right there in front of them, undeniable. "Log the time and the details," Evelyn instructed, keeping her tone steady. "Check the environmental sensors again. I want every possible explanation ruled out." The team moved quickly, each member performing their tasks with a quiet urgency. But the data told the same story it had all day. No airflow, no vibration, no external factors. The shroud had moved, and there was no clear reason why. As the hours stretched on, the tension in the lab grew unbearable. Every member of the team watched the screen with bated breath, their unease growing with every moment of stillness. It was as if they were waiting for something else to happen, something that none of them could predict. And then, as if responding to their thoughts, the shroud moved again. This time the shift was more pronounced. The fabric bunched slightly in the center, as though it had been gently pulled by an unseen hand. The team froze, their eyes glued to the screen. "That's not natural," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's deliberate." Evelyn felt her throat tighten, but she forced herself to stay composed. "Replay it," she said firmly. "Slow it down again." The footage showed the same thing. The shroud, perfectly still one moment, shifting in the next. The movement was slow and deliberate, as though something underneath it was stirring. Yet the camera showed nothing. No visible force. No disturbance. "It doesn't make sense," Sarah said, her hands trembling slightly. "There's nothing there. Nothing should be able to move it." The room fell silent again as the team grappled with the implications of what they were witnessing. For the first time since the experiment began, Evelyn felt a pang of fear. This wasn't just a scientific anomaly. It was something far stranger, far more unsettling. "Log everything," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "We need to stay focused. Whatever this is, we're here to observe it." But deep down, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer just observers. Whatever was happening inside the coffin, it felt intentional, as though it was aware of their presence. As the 24th hour approached, the atmosphere in the lab became almost unbearable. The earlier movements of the burial shroud had left the team rattled, and although no further disturbances had occurred, the silence now felt heavier, almost oppressive. Evelyn Carter sat at her desk, her eyes locked on the monitor. She had always prided herself on her ability to remain calm under pressure, but even she could feel the unease creeping in. Sarah broke the silence. "Do you think we'll see more movement?" she asked softly, her voice filled with both curiosity and dread. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she continued to watch the screen, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "But we need to stay alert. Whatever this is, it's not random." Daniel, who had been unusually quiet since the shroud's last movement, adjusted his headphones and leaned closer to the audio feed. "There's something strange here," he said suddenly, his voice sharp enough to draw everyone's attention. "What do you mean?" Evelyn asked, standing and moving toward him. "It's faint," Daniel replied, gesturing for silence. "But I think there's a sound." The team crowded around his station, their eyes wide with anticipation. Daniel adjusted the volume, and the room fell into complete silence as they strained to hear. At first, there was nothing, just the faint hum of the equipment. But then, slowly, a soft murmur emerged from the speakers. It was barely audible, more like a whisper carried on a distant wind. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. Low, strained, and undeniably human. "Is that interference?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Evelyn shook her head. "Run diagnostics," she said firmly. "Check the audio equipment and the connection." Daniel worked quickly, his fingers flying over the keyboard. But after a few moments he turned to Evelyn, his face pale. "The equipment's fine. There's no interference. The sound, it's coming from inside." The room went silent again, as the murmur continued, growing slightly clearer with each passing second. The team listened intently, their expressions a mix of fascination and fear. And then, suddenly, the words became clear enough to understand. "Why am I here?" The voice was soft but filled with an aching sadness. It repeated the question once more. "Why am I here?" Before fading into silence. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. The voice didn't match Harold's. It was younger, softer, and completely unrecognizable. She forced herself to remain calm even as her heart pounded in her chest. "Could it be some kind of recording?" Sarah suggested weakly, though her expression betrayed her doubt. "There are no recording devices in the coffin," Daniel replied. "And even if there were, how would they activate? The camera is the only device and it's live. This isn't a recording." Evelyn took a deep breath, her mind racing. "Amplify the sound," she said finally. "Let's hear it again." Daniel replayed the audio, enhancing the clarity as much as possible. The voice repeated its haunting question. "Why am I here?" The words were faint but distinct, carrying a weight that seemed to fill the room. "Log this immediately," Evelyn instructed, her tone sharp but controlled. "Time, audio frequency, everything." The team moved into action, their hands shaking slightly as they documented the event. But despite their focus on the technical details, the same question lingered in each of their minds. What were they hearing? The murmurs didn't return, leaving only an eerie silence in their place. Yet the voice had left a mark on everyone in the room. It wasn't just the words that disturbed them. It was the tone, the sorrow and confusion that seemed to seep into each syllable. Evelyn sat back down at her desk, her mind racing. This experiment was supposed to be about science, about observing natural processes. But now, it felt like they were venturing into something far beyond the boundaries of their understanding. As the minutes ticked by, Evelyn stared at the monitor, her thoughts filled with questions she couldn't yet answer. Who or what had spoken? And why did it sound like it was asking for help? By the 36th hour, the lab was steeped in a mix of exhaustion and tension. The voice that had spoken, soft, mournful, and inexplicable, played over and over in the team's minds. Despite their best efforts to rationalize it, no explanation made sense. Evelyn Carter paced the room, her arms crossed tightly as she tried to maintain her composure. She knew her team was looking to her for guidance, but deep down, she felt the same unease they did. The live feed from the coffin remained clear, showing the same still, fabric-lined interior. The burial shroud lay undisturbed, its earlier movements now seeming like distant memories. Yet the silence in the lab wasn't one of relief. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Daniel broke the tension. "I've been reviewing the audio," he said, his voice low. "The frequency of the voice, it doesn't match any known patterns of interference. It's real." Evelyn stopped pacing and turned to him. "You're certain?" Daniel nodded. "As certain as I can be. Whatever we heard, it came from inside that coffin." Evelyn nodded slowly, her mind racing. "Let's stay focused," she said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "We need to keep monitoring. Log everything, no matter how small." The team returned to their stations, their movements slower now, weighed down by the mental and emotional strain of the last 36 hours. The lab was quiet except for the soft hum of the equipment, but the stillness didn't last long. The burial shroud moved again. This time the motion was unmistakable. The fabric bunched in the center, pulling sharply to one side as though being tugged by invisible hands. The team froze, their eyes glued to the monitor. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We all saw it," Daniel replied, his tone grim. "Replay it." The footage was rewound and slowed down, and the movement played out again. The shroud's edges lifted and twisted, as though reacting to an unseen force. There was no airflow, no seismic activity, no logical explanation. Evelyn leaned closer to the monitor, her expression serious. "Mark this," she said quietly, "and enhance the feed." Daniel adjusted the camera's settings, zooming in on the shroud. The fabric had settled back into place, but something about it looked different. Subtle indentations had formed along its surface, faint yet distinct. "Are those marks?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She stared at the screen, her eyes scanning every inch of the shroud. The indentations were faint but unmistakable, like the outline of fingers pressing from beneath the fabric. "It looks like something touched it," Daniel said softly. Before Evelyn could respond, the audio feed crackled with static. The team tensed, their eyes darting to the speakers. The static faded quickly, replaced by a faint, rhythmic sound. It wasn't tapping this time. It was deeper, heavier, like the sound of something dragging against wood. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was steady and methodical, like a hand scraping slowly along the inside of the coffin's lid. The noise sent a chill through the room, each scratch reverberating in their ears. "Log the audio," Evelyn said, her voice firm despite the tension in the air. "I want every second recorded." As the scraping continued, the team sat frozen, their breaths held. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, filled with the weight of unanswered questions. The camera feed flickered. It was a brief distortion, but when the image stabilized, the team gasped. The shroud had shifted again, and this time faint letters were visible on the wooden lid of the coffin. The words weren't carved, but seemed to form naturally, as though etched by condensation or dust. Evelyn's heart pounded as she read the word, F-R-E-E. The room fell into stunned silence. No one spoke, their eyes fixed on the screen as the letters slowly faded. It was as if the word had never been there, leaving behind only the still, undisturbed interior of the coffin. "What does it mean?" Sarah asked finally, her voice barely audible. Evelyn didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind raced, grappling with the implications of what they had just witnessed. Was it a message, a plea, or something else entirely? As the team tried to process what they had seen, the audio feed crackled again. This time, a voice emerged, clearer and stronger than before. "Thank you." The words were soft but carried a sense of finality, as though whoever, or whatever had spoken them, was now at peace. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the feed cut out entirely. The screen went black and the lab was plunged into silence. Daniel scrambled to restore the connection, his hands flying over the keyboard. But no matter what he tried, the feed remained dead. The camera was offline, and the experiment was over. Evelyn sank into her chair, her hands trembling slightly. She stared at the blank monitor, her mind filled with unanswered questions. The experiment had begun as a quest for scientific knowledge, but it had ended with something far deeper, something that defied logic and understanding. "We've documented everything," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "But what we've witnessed, I don't think we'll ever fully understand it." The team sat in stunned silence, their expressions a mix of awe and fear. The experiment was over, but the mystery it had uncovered would stay with them forever. The lab was steeped in a heavy silence after the feed went dark. The equipment continued to hum softly, but the monitors, once filled with the hauntingly still image of the coffin's interior, now showed nothing but a blank screen. The team sat frozen at their stations, struggling to process what they had just experienced. Dr. Evelyn Carter broke the silence. "Is there any way to restore the connection?" she asked, her voice calm but strained. Daniel shook his head, his fingers still flying over the keyboard. The camera and sensors were functioning perfectly until just now. There's no indication of mechanical failure, but it's gone, completely offline. Sarah, her hands trembling slightly, looked up from her notes. "The timing of it's not random," she said softly. "It stopped after that voice. After it said, 'Thank you.'" Her words sent a chill through the room. Everyone was thinking it, but no one wanted to say it aloud. The voice, the message, the movements, none of it could be explained through science. They had witnessed something that went far beyond the boundaries of their understanding. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed tightly. She was a woman of logic, of evidence and facts. But now, faced with phenomena that defied all explanation, she felt a sense of unease she couldn't shake. "We need to focus on what we know," she said finally, her tone firm but quieter than usual. "Let's document every detail and analyze it thoroughly. We can't afford to jump to conclusions." The team nodded, though their expressions remained tense. They began reviewing the footage and audio, playing back every recorded moment in painstaking detail. The earlier tapping, the faint murmurs, the Shroud's movements, and the final messages were logged with meticulous precision. But as they combed through the data, the same unsettling realization emerged. There was no logical explanation for what they had witnessed. The sensors showed no external interference, no seismic activity, no changes in the environment that could account for the phenomena. The voice, the word free, and the final thank you defied every protocol and prediction they had set for the experiment. "Do you think it was Harold?" Sarah asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn paused, considering the question. "The voice didn't match his profile," she said finally. "It was younger, softer, and Harold, he was at peace with his decision. If anything, this felt like something, or someone else." The room fell into silence again as the implications of her words sank in. The experiment had been designed to observe the natural processes that occurred after burial, but instead it seemed to have uncovered something far more profound, something no one on the team had anticipated, or was prepared to face. "Whatever it was," Daniel said quietly, "it wanted to be free." Evelyn nodded slowly, her thoughts racing. "And now it is." The weight of her words hung in the air. The team had begun this journey in the pursuit of knowledge, but the answers they had sought had only led to more questions. What had they truly witnessed? Was it a natural phenomenon or something that defied the very principles of science? And most importantly, had their experiment inadvertently crossed a line they hadn't even known existed? Evelyn stood, her mind filled with conflicting emotions. "We've done what we set out to do," she said finally, addressing her team. "We've documented the unknown, but now it's time to let it rest." The team nodded, their exhaustion evident. One by one they began shutting down their workstations, their movements slow and deliberate. The lab, once filled with an electric anticipation, now felt somber, almost reverent. As Evelyn turned off the main monitor, she allowed herself one final glance at the blank screen. She had spent her life chasing answers, believing that science could illuminate even the darkest mysteries. But tonight, she realized, some questions were meant to remain unanswered. The experiment was over, but its impact would linger with them forever. And as Evelyn left the lab, the echoes of the voice, soft, mournful, and filled with gratitude, followed her into the quiet of the night.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.